Dearest reader, it has come to this author's attention that a quiet crisis is unfolding in classrooms across the land. Teachers speak publicly of differentiation and meeting all learners. They nod along at professional development about rigor and engagement. But behind closed doors, a different story. The ton may not speak of it, but this author shall. Today's paper concerns a young man. Let us call him Julian. Okay, I'm not going to do that for 90 minutes, but I am going to talk about Bridgerton and what Netflix's strategy for keeping fans engaged between seasons can teach us about the students we've been ignoring. First, though, let's talk about Julian and the system that's failing him. We've been told the rising tide lifts all boats, but what if we've only been lifting some of them? What happens when students who are ready for more don't get more? They don't fail, they don't struggle exactly, they just stop reaching. And when we stop stretching the top stops stretching. And that is what lowers the ceiling. We've focused on struggling learners with interventions and scaffolds and RTI, and the focus was right, but we've neglected the top, the kid who's curious and leaning in, the kid who's drifted into boredom. We spend so much energy on re engagement. What if we instead invested in keeping the engaged ones engaged? Let's sit with something for a minute. Think about your struggling students. These could be the ones reading below grade level, the ones who came to you with gaps. Now think about the systems your school has built around those students. There's response to intervention, there's tiered support, there's progress monitoring, there are reading specialists, intervention blocks, IEP meetings with teams of people, data trackers, benchmark assessments. Someone is always asking, how are your tier two students doing? What interventions are you using? Can we see the data? That, infra- that infrastructure exists. We built it, and we should have. Those students deserve support. We can talk in another video about whether or not that is actually working, but the point is we built it. It exists, and people are looking at it constantly. Now think about your students at the top, the ones who are ready for more, the ones that are curious, or the ones who could go deeper if someone showed them how. What's the infrastructure for them? In elementary school, maybe there's a gifted pull-out program, maybe a few hours with a specialist. But by high school, it's basically just you, right? Whatever you can manage to create whenever you have time, which is never. There's no RTI for the top, right? No intervention specialist asking, how are your high potential students doing? No progress monitoring for intellectual engagement. No team meetings about Julian. We built an entire system for one population and left the other to chance. And really, we have multiple of these populations, but we do not address them. We're focusing on a specific population for the most part. Or not we necessarily, but those above us are focusing on that. So naturally, that's something that we focus on because that's where the data is. And here's what makes it harder, right? The composition of our classrooms has changed. We expanded access to honors and advanced classes, and that's a good thing, in my opinion. More students getting opportunities they were gate kept out of before. Really great stuff. But many of those students, not necessarily just the students that traditionally were kept out, but there are many students who aren't prepared for the rigor of our classes. So they got access, but they didn't get preparation. So what happens? Honors teachers start doing intervention work inside honors classes. If you're teaching an honor section, but you're spending significant time on foundational skills, you're scaffolding down, right? You're differentiating for students who are maybe 2 years behind and students who are ready to go beyond. And the range in your room is wider than it's ever been. And I'm talking specifically about honors classes, but if we look at the general classes, it's sometimes even worse because you have a lower bottom and maybe the same top because the student has chosen like your regular class so that they could take their like honors everything else. So when the range is that wide, who gets your attention? It's the students who are struggling, right? The ones who will fail if you don't intervene and the ones that the system is asking you about constantly. So what happens is the ceiling lowers to meet the new floor, not because you don't care about the top, but because there's only so much of you. And then and then there's everything we did during COVID, right? We adopted practices to support students through a crisis. We had extended deadlines and flexible grading, reduced workload. grace as the operating principle. And those practices made sense in 2020 for sure. We were in survival mode, everyone was. But some of those practices stuck. The deadlines stayed flexible, the workload stayed reduced, the expectations never recalibrated. And I think we accidentally taught a generation of students, all students, not just struggling ones, that less effort is acceptable and that deadlines are suggestions and rigor is optional. We meant to support them, but we may have also signaled that reaching isn't required. So now we're trying to rebuild expectations with students who learned during formative years that school will meet them wherever they are, even if wherever they are is minimal effort. And Julian learned this too. He learned that efficiency is rewarded. He learned that good enough is enough. And he learned that there's no cost in coasting. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about at all. You became an English teacher because you love this stuff. You love the weird connections and the moment when a student really understands how Paradise Lost illuminates Frankenstein. You love going down that rabbit hole and coming back with something that makes the text crack open. You love being a nerd about this. But when does that happen now? When every class period requires constant scaffolding, when you manage a 3-year readiness gap in one room, when the institutional pressure is all about intervention data and struggling student support, the parts of teaching that actually fill your cup, like the intellectual play, the literary conversations, the wait until you see this moments, those get squeezed out first because they feel like extras, like luxuries, like things you'll get to when there's time, but there's never time. So you're surviving, you're getting through the curriculum, you're supporting struggling students and managing behavior and grading papers and attending meetings, but you're not thriving. And neither are your top students because the joy leaked out for them and for you. So I'm going to guess you've probably tried to address this before. It may have been a long time ago, but I bet this is something that you've tried or at least thought about. Maybe thought about a reading list or an extension menu, something for early finishers, like an early finishers folder, maybe a choice board with some extra options. And if you're like me, it worked for about a week and then it gathered dust. Or maybe you made it and then you perhaps even printed it and then you looked at it, looked at your students and were like, nah, maybe not today. So the reading list sat there. The extension menu got ignored. The if you finish early folder became a thing students knew existed but never touched, or maybe they forgot about it because you only said it once and they need you to tell them at least 20 times. But why? Because without a system, enrichment is one more thing you have to maintain, one more thing to create and update and nag students about and track. And students could tell it was optional before. Not optional because you said this is optional, but optional because it was structurally disconnected. It didn't feed into anything. And as a result, it didn't matter to them. Enrichment became extra credit at best, busy work at worst. It's not that you lack ideas. Your Google Drive is full of rabbit holes you went down while planning, or maybe your phone or your Chrome or whatever it is where you take notes, your notebooks. Books you wished students would read. Oh my gosh, I have so many of those. And then documentaries that changed how you see a text, maybe connections you've made over years of teaching that you never have time to share. So the content isn't the problem, it's the architecture. You don't have a place for your expertise, a structure that makes it visible, sustainable, and self reinforcing, and doesn't require you to push it uphill every day. That's what we're going to build. So here's where we are. The system forgot about the top. The classroom composition shifted, the expectation softened, the joy leaked out. And your previous attempts at enrichment didn't stick because they were strategies without structure. So we are not going to work harder because you're already working hard. We're going to build an architecture like a system that lets you bring your expertise into the room without it being one more thing. So we're going to build a structure that creates insiders who lift the whole class, a way to get back to the parts of teaching that made you want to do this in the first place. And I found a place for it in the last place I expected, Netflix. So what happens with Bridgerton is that some of their customers will cancel in between the shows that they really are enjoying. So like Bridgerton. And that means that they need to have an always on ecosystem where in between those seasons, they have ways to engage their customers. We need that too. So students check out between assignments. What we need is an enrichment layer where we can engage students between assignments. And if we look at Netflix's model, what they're doing is understanding that retention is cheaper than acquisition. And in the same way, for us, keeping students engaged is easier than re engaging them. And if we just think about how that could translate to our classroom, if we are able to retain our students instead of continually re engaging them, then that will have some energy fits for ourselves. Okay, so what we often do is when we think about what we're going to do to give our students enrichment, we often think about how to give them more work. And we've been taught very clearly that that is not the answer, but we haven't really had anything to refill that. So, what are we supposed to do? We don't want to give them free time. We don't want to give them more work and punish them, but they're done. So, what do we do? So, what we need is something that where he can go that is going to keep him engaged and understand that something that I've been experimenting with is a approach that when we're in English class, we are going to do English. So you can finish early, that's fine. You're going to go do some more English. It doesn't need to be something that's going to be like harder or something that's going to be, feel like busy work. So that's the challenge, right? We need to find something that's going to be additional because like it has to be if they're done, right? It's going to be more work in some way, but it needs to be something that's going to feel like it has some kind of payoff for our kid Julian. Okay, so when we look at Netflix's retention model, they recognize that viewers binge a season. So, in the same way that our students finish assignments and they drift away before the next season drops. So, they have this ecosystem, and we'll get into these things more as we relate to them to the classroom, but they have the show itself, and then they have Netflix House, which is immersive. They have all these experiences that you can have that extend your understanding of Bridgerton. So they have Tidum, which is their website for fans. So you can watch some different like behind the scenes. You can get some learn about the costumes. You can listen to the podcast. And then they also have brand partnerships. So this is a little bit of world building. So helping you to live in the world of Bridgerton by, you know, using Dove soap or, making your Betty Crocker skins. So in this way, what they're doing is trying to retain those customers in between seasons. Okay, so Netflix built this ecosystem. It has multiple entry points, this always on engagement, and insiders who recruit other insiders. But we're not Netflix. We can't just copy their tactics. We need to understand what problems they're solving and then figure out which of these problems exist in our classrooms. Here's what I see. The first problem is that some students will opt in and some won't. You're going to have Julians who are curious and who will click on the rabbit hole and pick up a book from your list just because it sounds interesting. And you're going to have students who won't. They'll see enrichment and think that's optional and choose a path of least resistance every time. If your system only works for students who opt in, you've just recreated the gifted pullout model, and the curious get curiouser and everyone else goes. So you need something for both populations. Do you remember why your reading list gathered dust or why your extension menu got ignored when you pulled that out in the distant past? It is probably, if you're like me, because it didn't really connect to anything. Students could engage with it or not, and nothing changed either way. So the enrichment existed in this parallel universe from the real work of the class. If it if enrichment doesn't pay off somewhere visible, then students learn it doesn't matter. In a way, they're right. So you need a destination, a place where engagement becomes currency. You are already stretched thin. I know. I get it. If the enrichment layer requires you to build new materials or write new assignments or create new assessments, it won't survive contact with October or February in this case. But here's the thing, you already have the content. It's in your head, it's in your drive, it's the stuff you know, but never have time to teach. So you don't need to create, it's more that you need to curate, organize what you already have into a structure students can access. So Julian might already get A's, so more points don't move him. Extra credit is meaningless when you're already at the top of the scale. What motivates and engaged learners isn't grades, it's recognition, being seen as someone who knows things and having insider knowledge that others don't. So that's what you're pulling on, letting them be the person who brings something to the conversation that shifts the room. So, what we need is to build a reward structure that's built on recognition and not just points. So, if Julian goes down a rabbit hole and nobody ever knows, what was the point? Okay, he learned something for sure, but the room didn't change. So the goal isn't just individual depth, it's collective elevation. Insiders should lift the whole room, not through presenting what they learn necessarily, but through being in the conversation with knowledge others don't have. So we need a structure where individual engagement benefits everyone. And then the final problem is we can't actually mandate enrichment, but optional gets ignored. Here's the trap, right? If you make enrichment required, it's not enrichment anymore. It's just more work. And now you're grading it, chasing it, creating consequences for students who don't do it. You've added a power struggle to your plate. Nobody wants this. But if you make it truly optional, ungraded, no consequences, a significant portion of your students will never engage. And in a way, that's fine because it's not for everyone, but it is for some students, and you need to have some kind of pulse. Optional means not real to students who've learned to optimize for points, so we need to account for that. So what do we have here? You can't make it required, you can't leave it toothless, and you definitely don't have the energy for another battle of wills. The solution isn't grades, it's actually natural consequences visible throughout the unit. So we're going to build in moments where students who engage have something others don't and have information that only insiders can answer, bonus angles on the writing prompt. So in this way, you're not going to be punishing non-engagement. You're not creating consequences, but we'll be designing a structure where engagement pays visible dividends and non-engagement means just missing out on something others got. Students notice when their classmates know things they don't, and that noticing does more work than any points ever could. And what is great about the system is you're not the enforcer because the system does the work. Here's what we need architecturally as we develop this three-part system: strategies for students who opt in and students who won't, a path that makes engagement matter, curation from expertise, not creation from scratch, recognition, not points, natural consequences visible throughout the unit. So, Netflix's ecosystem gives us a model, but we need to translate it into something that works in a classroom with 30 students with 50 or 90-minute periods and one teacher who's already maxed out. So, we'll work through three strategies. Each one solves a different piece. Well, the first one is the insiders list. This is for students who will opt in. This is your always on discovery hub where you'll put books, rabbit holes, connections, curriculum connected content students can explore on their own time. And this is based on Netflix's Tidum website, deep dives that give fans insider access. So this is where your expertise lives, and what you know but don't have time to teach is going to be where we curate, not create. The second strategy is the playlist for students who won't opt in but should. So, some students that should be taking opportunities of enrichment will never click on the insiders list. They'll pass every single time. And the sad truth is you can't force them to choose enrichment, but you can embed the stretch inside the required work. This strategy is based on Netflix's premiere Masquerade, which is a curated experience everyone attends, but the depth is there for those who are ready to find it. So, same task, invisible differentiation. And in this case, they don't even know that they're striving because of the way that we're going to embed it. And then the final is I'm calling it a choice board, but just stick with me because it's quite different from what you may have known in the past. But this is where it all pays off. This is the destination that makes everything else matter. And at the end of the unit, students will facilitate a conversation in this case based on the expertise they've built. So different doors, same task, based on Netflix's brand partnerships in this case. Everyone brings their own angle to a shared work. And the student who read from the insiders list from the first strategy brings their book connections. And the student who went down one of the rabbit holes brings in their knowledge. So they're bringing in different expertise, same intellectual work. And here's the key: Students who engage with enrichment have more to say, and students who didn't still have a path, but they notice that their classmates brought something they couldn't. And that noticing matters. Next unit, some of them may make different choices. So these aren't three separate strategies you pick from. They're architecture and they work together. So the insider list catches students who opt in, the playlist stretches students who don't, and the choice board creates the payoff where both paths converge and also show people what they're missing that didn't choose this to begin with. The insiders list feeds the playlist. Students who explored rabbit holes bring that knowledge into partner work and their partners notice. And then the playlist builds towards the choice board. The analytical skills everyone practices becomes the foundation for the final conversations. And then the choice board circles back to the insiders list. So students who saw classmates bring deeper expertise think, maybe I should explore that stuff next time. So it's almost like a cycle and not a checklist. One more thing about how this works before we really get into it, the payoff can't just live at the end. Students don't see benefit until the choice board in week 4 or week 6, whatever the end of the unit is, they won't engage in week 1. So the system has to surface advantages throughout. So the way this will work is in week 1, you'll introduce the insider list and a few students will start exploring. Week 2, you'll drop a question only insiders can answer. So for instance, if you watch the Cosmos episode, you know something about Faraday that changes how we read the scene. What is it? So students who engage get to be experts, and students who didn't notice that's something that they can't answer. And then in week 3, we have the playlist. So Julian brings his rabbit hole knowledge into partner work, and his partner hears something she didn't know. And then we're able to get a little bit of momentum. And then finally, in week 4 or whatever the end of the unit is, we have this choice board where students who built expertise have doors where they can pull on that information that they learned in the enrichment layer. So students who didn't have fewer options, and it's not punishment, it's a natural consequence. And then so the way that this works is each week engagement pays off visibly, not through grades, but through moments of I know something you don't know, and it matters right now. I can say something. So that's what makes the system self reinforcing. Students don't engage because you told them to, they engage because they saw what engagement gets you. That's the architecture overall. 3 strategies, 1 system. Now, let me show you each piece, what it looks like, how to build it, and how it plays out for Julian. Okay, so we are going to think about this in episodes. We're going to put together our season of enrichment. Our first episode is going to be the insiders list. This is for exploration. And then the second episode is the playlist. This is where we are going to stretch students that maybe don't want to be stretched. And then in episode 3, this is going to be a choice board, but it is a special choice board where actually all the things that they've done voluntarily will pay off. Okay, so what we're thinking is when we are able to retain our students, that is a lower cost and like a lower energy cost than actually acquisition. In this case, it would mean like re-engaging students. When we have engagement, when we have engaged students, that reduces those dead zones between assignments. And if we do this correctly, we actually have students that become advocates for our unit. They can then bring that energy back to the whole room. And also, we are thinking about sustainability. So, we're going to think about how we can curate this instead of create. So, this is not about building new content, it is using what you already know and packaging it for students. Of course, you are not Netflix. You do have the assets, though. So when you are unit planning, there are things that you definitely throw out. This is going to be like your cutting room floor. So what we're thinking about is what can you do to help students to fall down a rabbit hole? I think about it as like pushing them down a rabbit hole. What can we give them that we are not able to bring into the regular class about historical context that they might be able to engage with? What connections can they make to other books? And also, what expertise do you have that you've gained along the way that you can let students into so you can kind of like bring them into the fold or like help them have a little bit of insider knowledge? So, just take a couple minutes now and think about what do you know about this text that makes you read it differently? And that is your raw material for your engagement layer, for your enrichment layer. So, Again, you're not going to research new things. You're organizing the expertise you already have and thinking about what you would do if you could spend like an entire year teaching this text. I think about that sometimes like, man, if I could like teach Paradise Lost all year, they would definitely know it really well. So thinking about what you can do to help them to be a more experienced learner. All right, so here's what we got: the insider list, the playlist, and the choice board. So, this is the whole system that we are going to be talking through. Okay, so let's take a look at episode one. So, this is the insiders list. Okay, so the way that I'm thinking about this, based on the Netflix's website to them. So, if you take a look at it, it has articles, it has deep dives that give fans insider access. What we're going to tap into is the psychology of an engaged learner. So, if you just think about like if you had a student that was like your ideal student in the classroom, what would they be doing when they finished an assignment? They might be picking up a book, like picking up their independent reading book and reading it. Ideally, if we're talking like, pie in the sky, they would be reading a book that relates to the book that we're reading in class. So that helps them to have synergy. They're able to make connections across contexts. They're able to make connections to history, to science, to what they're learning, what they learned last year. And also, they would follow their curiosity. Like maybe they'd see an illusion and they'd look it up and then they'd read something about it. They might read the whole text. They might see how other people have used that illusion. So, what we're going for is not extra credit necessarily, but giving students a place where they can actually practice these habits of an advanced learner. Because I think one of the things that's happened over the years is that we haven't really modeled for students what that looks like because we've been focused on the other things. So this is our opportunity to really give students that model of what they should be doing. So we're thinking about how we can have something that's curriculum connected, again, that is curated, something that you do not have to then go out and make. This is based on like your overflow. And also, we're going to think about having something or having some aspects of this be winnable. So, we want it to be some students will just have like we tell them that it's there and they'll get excited and just do it. Some of them we have to think about those different player types. And for some students, the player type is they want to win, right? That's their goal in playing. So we want to have an endpoint and have some way for them to know that they have achieved the finish line. The way that I am approaching this is having an invisible point system. So this is like, I don't really want this to be something where I have that big leaderboard that you might have done when you gamified like a decade ago, where you had the spreadsheet with all the formulas. We're not doing that. What we're doing instead is thinking about how we can just recognize students for the work that they're doing. Now, one of the things that I like to think about when I'm giving students assignments, I want to think about what I can do. Like maybe I'm going to grade it, but maybe I'm just going to recognize that they've done it, recognize that they've put work into it. So part of what we're going to do here is just recognize that they have put work into this and that we appreciate it. The ways that they can show this is by contributing to shelf talkers, recommendations, and bonus knowledge. And this is going to actually unlock intrinsic awards, which they do not know yet, but we'll get into in a little bit. So, what they would do is write reviews for the books that they read. They might have, if they follow our rabbit holes, they'll have special angles. And also, if we look at just the way that people work, most fans don't actually want any payment. They want recognition. And I think our students are the same way. So I have here a completion badge. And one of the things that I did is I made stickers. So if you're like part of this insider club, you get a sticker. So what are we actually doing here? So we have two layers, and I'm going to show you how this works in my Frankenstein unit. The first layer is a book challenge. So they have various categories that they would be looking at where like those are some examples written by a romantic, science fiction, etc. And then the second layer are rabbit holes that they could go to. So the Prometheus enhancement. So I have, if you have my Frankenstein unit, you've seen this where I had AI create a story and then we talk about it's like parallel to Frankenstein. I don't have the time this year to actually use it, but I think it's pretty awesome. So what I'm doing is I'm putting this in this enrichment layer, and it has like questions and engagement kind of things. I've really gotten into how the romantic period is really similar to like modern anime. So what I would like them to do is look at the first episode of Psychopaths. And this does have some violence, so I'm gonna have to have them kind of sign off, have their parents sign off on it. But looking at Psychopaths and making connections to like monstrosity and also like ethics, and I think it'll be really interesting for them to look at. One thing I have done almost every year is have them watch the Electric Boy episode of The Cosmos, which is Michael Faraday. I see a lot of parallels with Michael Faraday and the creature, but also I think it's really good for them to understand like what the period was like. I think it Michael Faraday has a really interesting story because of the way that he grew up. He was originally very poor, and then he just had a lot of he took the opportunities that he had, and he was able to be very successful, one of the pioneer scientists of the time. I'm not going to actually have them look at Bridgerton specifically, but thinking about Bridgerton, I made this like realization the other day that Bridgerton is during the Regency period, which ended in about 1820. And of course, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1818. So she was living the Regency period. And one of the things that was really interesting to me when I started thinking about this is it shows how important that social climbing is. Also, the rigidity of the courting structure, the balls, the way that they would have been going to their, London house and their country house, that kind of thing. And the gender dynamics of the time as well. It also helps us to understand what it actually meant that Mary Shelley was writing a novel when we think about what's happening in Bridgerton and the role that writing plays. Like, as I said, of course, I'm not going to be having them watch Bridgerton, but that does help me to think about one of those things that I want for them to understand about the time period. And honestly, I wasn't really thinking about it in this way until I realized that they were at the same time. Um, because it helps us to understand how radical Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley really were at this time. Okay, so um, what does the reading challenge look like? So it can be really simple. So what I am thinking about is Goodreads. Did you know like those Goodreads challenges that we used to do? I used to do. So you get like a bunch of categories, you decide what you want to do, how you're going to fulfill those points, and then you read books and you like document them. So you said like I read whatever in this category. So I have 12 categories, and I could make these different point values if I wanted to. That's how it works in Goodreads challenges. But I also gave them some suggestions of how they might fulfill the different periods. So I just gave you an example of two of the different ones where I have here are some books that you might read. And if I look at this, like I'd really love for everybody to read Age of Wonder. I think that that's a really good book to understand who like the time period. Romantic Outlaws, I think, is great to understand Mary Shelley and her mother. And then I also would really love for everybody to read Anatomy, a Love Story. Wuthering Heights is a book that's on our curriculum, and if they read that, I think that gives them a different kind of understanding of the time period, and I think that would be really good. So I'm putting things that, like, I wish that they read anyway, but I can't assign because we don't have the time. Okay, so that's the challenge itself. This is my classroom, and what I'm doing is what I was thinking is I wanted to create this, like, liminal space where students felt like they were in the classroom, but also not really in the classroom. And I was also thinking about Bitmoji classrooms. So that is where I came up with this idea. I took this picture of my classroom and I made it into a couple different things. So I use Gemini to do this, and I told it first that I wanted it to be like kind of lo-fi feeling. So it added a little bit of comfy living here, some I already have some alternate seating, but it added a little bit more. And you see that I have these like hot spots. This is where I'll connect to different things. So I'll have my reading challenge going here. I'll have some audio that they can connect to here. I'm gonna have, just various things that could be like, we're gonna go down rabbit holes here. So, I also was thinking once I got into this was that I could make this very specific to my classroom, like what we're doing for each unit. So I made one that felt like it was in the 1800s. So I have the same hotspots. And so what I can do is I can just swap out this picture and have the hotspots in the same place each time. So when we change units, the students know what to look for, or where everything goes. And it still feels like that, like my classroom, but not really my classroom. I also took one and I made it futuristic. So when we're reading sci-fi, it has still my classroom, but not my classroom. And I thought that that would be just a fun way to present this. So what I'll do is this is just like where my insiders go. So there'll be just this, or there's this image on my LMS where they can click and go to this like liminal space, this like not our classroom, where they have enrichment, follow those hotspots. One of them will take them to the book challenge. They'll go to various places, but it's a consistent visual in a way, like it's always our not classroom, like the other classroom, but it's a consistent kind of visual space. And just remember, like, this is not graded, it's going to be recognized, and the students are earning those invisible points. And what they'll do when they are like doing these different activities is they'll be doing recommendation forms, those shelf talkers. If they include it in discussion, then they can if they bring it meaningfully into conversation, then I'll take note of that. And they might mention this on their regular check in forms. So, another option that I'm going to give, I don't know if students will take me up on it, haven't really in the past, but quick shares of what they're reading. Actually, we do this. Just like, does anybody want to recommend a book? And the thing is though, that all of these like declarations that you've been participating in the enrichment layer means that they are able to unlock something later. So students have told me that they're reading something, or they've looked at those Prometheus materials, or they've watched the Cosmos episode, they will unlock bonus questions throughout the unit. So I'm thinking we are going to be doing assignments, of course, right? So on each of the assignments, have like an optional question, which could be extra credit for students who have already told me that they're engaging. So you can't like just decide to try to like take a stab at this question. You have to tell me that you've already watched that Cosmos episode. And then when we get to the final assessment, they will actually have more to draw from, which is also a surprise. I'm not going to announce any of this. The invisible points are invisible, and I want it to be students engaging and feeling like they are doing this intrinsically. So the engagement is supposed to be the award, but there will be some like additional rewards for people that engage. So um, once Julian has a place to go, what happens is he's invited to explore, and that leads to a different type of student. Okay, so how do you get here? So the first thing is to start with your overflow. Before you build anything, look at what's already in your drive. What did you save but couldn't use? What rabbit holes did you go down while planning? And what do you know that you never have time to share? That's your raw material. It could even be like you just don't teach it that way anymore, but you liked it. I know that I have a bunch of those. Like I could teach Frankenstein like 6 or 7 or 22 different ways. And I can't do that every year. So, but I could give them a lot of those angles. And if I'm thinking about an enrichment layer as I'm planning those things that I decide that I'm not going to use, but I really like, I can just keep track of those and put them in that engagement layer. So the point is just not making new content, organizing expertise you already have, thinking about maybe what does another teacher do with this text that you've always wanted, or you always thought was brilliant, but you didn't really have time to add it. Like I have in my department when we're teaching Frankenstein, there's a teacher that looks at Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner and looks at the images that go with Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and she has a whole activity with that. We have those images, like we have books of the images in our department library, so I could definitely pull on that. I could like in the past, I've taught Paradise Lost. Right now, there are teachers in my department in my grade level that are really going into Paradise Lost, but I do not have time right now in my curriculum to do that. But that is something that I could add pretty easily to an enrichment layer. So some students will go there and will be ready for it. I'm also adding my bulletin board, adding the reading there. But again, like making completion possible. So making and really just lightly tracking. The recommendation forms and the check-ins give you enough visibility without creating a grading nightmare. We are definitely not adding more to make this feel crazy. All right. Think about this. What books do you wish your students would read alongside your next anchor text, and what would make them better readers of that text? So you probably already have a mental list. Just write down 5 of those, and that's the start of your book challenge. The second question to think about is, what do you know about this text that makes you read it differently? And that's your rabbit hole content. What would you tell students if you had more time? Just write down those 3 connections, and you've already drafted your insiders list. So when we think about this, Julian sees the bulletin board, he sees those 12 categories, maybe he gets interested in 1 or 2 of them, and he takes a look at that attic because you've maybe made him, or he chooses it on his own. He sees a Cosmos episode because he's into science, and he starts looking at Faraday and recognizes that he's self-educated, a bookbinder's apprentice. He's curious about that. He's not being told to read more or watch more necessarily. He's just invited to explore. And unlike the assignment he just finished, no one's actually requiring this. It's just there for him, and he gets to choose what he wants to look at. So he picked the category and queues up the episode, and he has a place to go that helps him to engage better. So we've created the list, we've given Julian content he hopefully actually wants to explore. But the truth is, not every Julian will opt in, right? Some students will see the insider's list and say no thanks. Even if you tell them that they have to be working on English, they'll pass. They'll stick with the minimum. They might actually even fake it so that instead of taking their 20 minutes as usual, they'll stretch it out to 45 or whatever it is that you're giving them. But we don't want to just let them coast, because remember, what we're trying to do is raise all boats by raising the kids that could potentially be lifting others up. So we also can't necessarily force them to choose enrichment. So what do we do? This is the next strategy, which is the playlist. So this is where we're going to stretch students who won't opt in. So we know that some students will never choose enrichment, and they might think of it as a punishment if we direct them to it and tell them that they have to stay in English. They might see that insider's list. They might just look at what we've made for them and say whatever. They understand that they have done what they need to get the grade that they want, and that they've done it to maximum efficiency, and might resist that they have to do anything else. And the truth is, you can't force them to opt in. Mandatory enrichment isn't enrichment. It's, if it was, it would just be more required work, and saying that some students have to do those required work is, and others don't, just gets you into this weird space where you're like, okay, well, what do I do now? And I would say what a lot of us have done with this kind of conundrum is that we've done nothing. So we also don't want to just let them coast, right? So you know they're capable of more. You know the stretch would be good for them, but how do you get them to go there? So if they won't choose the stretch, our next strategy is to embed it and design an assignment where everyone goes further than they'd choose on their own, and it doesn't feel like extra. And also choosing some students to actually push a little bit more. Okay, so Netflix did this thing, and I mentioned it at the towards the beginning of the episode. It says Premiere Masquerade. So this was a main event, but unless you are really a fan of Bridgerton, you might not have known that this was even happening. So the way that this worked is you just had to go to Tidum website. there was a place where you could sign up, and then what happened is you got a special link that took you to a live stream in Paris where there was a red carpet. They did some interviews, and then they screened the first episode 2 weeks before it came out to everybody else. So it was this curated sequence everyone experienced, and in that way, it builds anticipation partly because it is a timed event, but then it also creates this feeling of being an insider without requiring any extra choices. So you just kind of show up and then it brings you through this sequence of events that helps you to better understand the show, get a little bit of like the interviews, the screening, and you feel like you're an insider. And your playlist does the same thing. So it's designed as a sequence embedded in your regular assignment. So what's happening is it's at first appears to be the same task for everyone. What we're going to do a little bit different than what Netflix is doing is we're actually going to use this to stretch our students that we have identified. We're going to push everybody further than they'd push themselves, but we're also going to specifically push our students that we've identified as ones that would be capable of some stretch. So, okay, so what we're going to do is we'll have an assignment. I'm using Frankenstein chapters 13 through 14. I talked about Paradise Lost and how I'd like to do a little bit more with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at character psychology. And we're going to look a little bit at Paradise Lost itself, and trying to understand why the creature identifies with Satan by understanding Paradise Lost better. Everyone is going to do that. We're going to look at 4 passages and I'll be doing 3 passages, 4 passages. And at a point in the assignment, it's going to split where the questions are going to start supporting a different final answer. When students are completing this assignment, they're looking at the same passages. Some students will be looking at just character psychology and why does the creature feel wronged by looking at text excerpts of Paradise Lost. The enrichment path, they're going to be doing the same assignment, but they're also going to be looking at authorial intent. So, why did Shelley give him this specific text? In this case, we're going to be doing comparative literature and also a little bit more of historical context. So, it's a little bit more enriched, right? It has a little bit more texture to it. So, what Julian might be able to do is actually pull a connection between Faraday and the creature during his partner work. So, I'd want to structure this in a way that people that are on the regular path are together and people that are on the enrichment path are together, but they might be pulling on different information because of the path that they took during their enrichment layer. So, in this way, what happens when students are able to pull on what they did in their enrichment layer is they understand that the insider's list actually becomes something of currency, that they're able to bring in information that they wouldn't have otherwise. So, so how do we do this? The first thing that we're going to do is identify the operation. So, what's the cognitive operation you want them to practice? It could be author's craft with a specific frame. It could be close reading for a specific element, like characterization or tone or argument structure, applying a critical lens, annotating for a specific purpose. And this is going to actually stay constant through your entire activity. And then sequence your inputs. We want them to be first, like the first one is going to be very accessible, good for learning the operation, and then we want it to get more complex and have more to notice. And then the third one is going to be the most complex. And this is where we could have the split happen right here. So we're going to have the same operation, but the input gets harder. So if we go back to what we're doing, we're having all students do the same kind of reading task, but they're looking for something slightly different as we move forward. And the complexity with the enrichment starts to be in thinking about like adding an additional layer of thinking about author's purpose. So finally, what we want to do is make sure like what would we as a final step, how could we make this a richer input for this same kind of operation? So we're still looking at characterization, but we're also now thinking about author's purpose. And we also want to think about how we can recognize our insiders. So, how can we include questions that lead them to bring in that insider knowledge and help them to understand that the enrichment layer is like a natural extension and not a punishment? So, one of the things, like, I've done this quite a bit in the past is either assigning it directly through the LMS. So I'd say these students get this assignment, these students get this assignment, or handing out assignments with everyone's name on them. So it's not immediately clear to students who's getting what, they're just getting something that was assigned to them. So think about this. What's one passage from your anchor text where you always wish students had more context first? And then think about what would they need to read, see, or understand before that passage hits the way it should. And that's your first playlist candidate. So when we think back to Julian, what happens is he's working through the playlist with his partner. They both are building the creature's chart, thinking about how he is identifying with Satan. And then Julian starts thinking about Faraday and the creature because of some question that hinted at it a little bit. And he starts thinking about their self education and how they had different experiences based on their welcoming. His partner is like, "Hey, where'd you get that?" And Julian is able to say that it was on the list and that he was able to get that enrichment and bring it in as currency. So in this way, we're reinforcing the insiders list a little bit more. It's more interesting because Julian didn't tell his partner to read more, but his partner also now understands that what is on that list is going to help students to do better. And when we're thinking about our clientele, in some ways, there might be students that never do this, but if we have this if we have this environment where students understand that if they do more, they get more, then that helps that rising tide. This is where the rising tide metaphor actually works because the insiders are lifting the whole room. They're working alongside their peers in being that kind of peer mentor. So where have we been? We've built that space thinking about our liminal space of where our enrichment layer can actually exist and created that challenge with the reading challenge and also the rabbit holes. And we've thought about how we can design assignments that stretch everyone, even students who won't opt in, and also how we can reinforce the invisible layer for our students. So, what does all of this engagement actually lead to? And this is episode 3, the choice board. And before you get to choice board, I'll just like talk to you a little bit about where this came from for me. I was thinking again about Bridgerton's season 4 marketing. And if you've been following this at all, you know that they have a lot of brand partnerships. I find Netflix's business model really interesting and the way that they've done product placement. And I actually have a resource that I created and used where we look at Netflix's product placement so that students can rate it because honestly, it's a little concerning, but a lot of them don't even recognize when there is product placement. So it's a skill that we want our students to have. But also, one of the things that they do differently here, and they've actually done it a little bit more as the years have gone on. They did it a lot more with Stranger Things, like actually building a partnership with what is it? The Eggo, waffles, and they also have one with Dungeons& and Dragons game. They've, made a lot more partnerships like cereal. So, in this case, they partnered with Dove and Pandora, NYX, Liberty of London, Walmart, the Netflix house. But what's important to understand that they didn't do, they are looking at their partners and saying, "Here is what they do best. Let's use that as an entry into our product placement relationship or our marketing relationship." Like, they're not asking Dove to make jewelry. They're asking Dove to make personal care items, right? They didn't ask Pandora to create fragrances. That doesn't make sense for Pandora. And they didn't ask NYX to design immersive experiences. That's what their Netflix house is for. So each partner brought their own expertise to a shared world. So Dove does its thing. It does self-care. So Dove created a Bridgerton self-care line, and Pandora does those keepsakes. So they created a Bridgerton jewelry line. NYX does transformation. So they created a makeup collection. So different products, different entry points, but the same aesthetic in the same world, the same emotional core. And when you bring these all together, you're able to understand or kind of live in Bridgerton in a different way. What Netflix is pulling on is understanding that fans are different. Some fans will want to wear the world, some want to smell it, some want to visit it, but you don't force everything through the same door. You create multiple doors, and behind each one, fans can find something that fits how they engage. So that's the model for your choice board. When I think about traditional choice boards, and maybe this is what you have been thinking as I was talking about Netflix, but what they usually look like is something like a six squares. You pick one, you might write a poem for a character's perspective and then create a timeline of events, design a movie poster, compare two characters using a Venn diagram, write a letter to the author, make a playlist for a character. It looks like differentiation. And the students get to choose, they get agency, they get voice. But there are two problems here, and they're both design problems. And I just want to be clear, like, I've definitely done that choice board in the past that looked like I just took a bunch of assignments and put them on a document because that's what I did. Okay, so two problems. They're both design problems. The first problem is that each square requires a completely different cognitive operation. A poem is creative synthesis, a timeline is sequencing, a Venn diagram is analytical comparison, and a playlist is thematic connection. So, this is like asking Dove to make jewelry and perfume and immersive experiences and fashion. It's not leveraging expertise, it's scattering effort. And students optimize for comfort, not growth generally, right? So the artistic kid makes the poster, the strong writer writes the essay, the kid who doesn't want to think too hard maybe makes a playlist, and nobody stretches. And this is a problem, right? And we also have a second problem in that we are assessing what we didn't teach. And this is a deeper issue because if writing a poem is a legitimate assessment option, then we should have been teaching students how poems work during the unit. We should have been looking at structure and line breaks and sound and image and the moves poets make. And if creating a podcast is on the board, students should have been learning what makes a podcast effective. So looking at pacing and voice and how audio storytelling differs from written storytelling. And if designing a movie poster is an option, you should have taught visual rhetoric, composition, color theory, how images argue. But that's not what happens, right? Choice boards treat these products as interchangeable outputs, as if make a poster and write an essay requires the same presentation, just different preferences. But they don't. And when you put write a poem on a choice board without teaching poetry, you're not really differentiating. You're actually abandoning, saying, figure it out yourself and I'll grade whatever you produce. And it's a little maddening because we get that quite a bit when we talk about like UDL and we talk about differentiation to give students different options for how they show you their work. And while I don't think that this is a bad idea, I do think in practice that this is not exactly what we are supposed to do because what we end up doing is not really giving student choice. It's more curriculum incoherence dressed up as agency. So, real differentiation isn't choice in product, it's choice in content with consistent thinking. So, if you want students to write poems, you teach poetry all unit and have everyone write a poem. If you want students to create podcasts, you teach podcasting and have everyone create a podcast. But if your unit has been building analytical skills like close reading, making claims, supporting with evidence, connecting text, then your assessment should ask for that work. I don't think that this is like really something that is ridiculous or surprising to anyone, but we somehow like do this weird thing. Like we end up assessing on six different products that we never taught. In this way, Netflix partners are all doing the same thing. They're all extending the Bridgerton world in ways that create emotional connection, but they do it through their particular expertise that they already have. And this idea is what we're going to pull on as we are creating our choice board. So everyone is doing the same intellectual work, which is the work we've been teaching. But students choose what content to bring to that work based on the expertise they've built through the unit. So you see, like, if they've been building this Prometheus specialized information or specialized expertise, they can bring that. If they've been looking at psychopaths and they've been looking at the genre and how they can relate that to Frankenstein, or maybe they've been looking at the ethics of intelligence, or maybe they've been looking with psychopaths about like fate and how that plays into identity. If they've been looking at cosmos, maybe they want to pull more scientific history. And Maybe they've been reading a book that they can make a connection to and they want to make some literary connections between the two. If they've been doing nothing, they still have an option. That's going to be a synthesis looking at unit patterns that don't include that enrichment layer. So, what I'm thinking for this unit that I've been discussing, my Frankenstein unit, instead of pick your product, what we're doing is pick your content. So, which rabbit hole do you bring? So, the task stays constant. What they're going to be doing is facilitating a peer conversation. So, not necessarily presenting or summarizing, but facilitating and bringing an insight others wouldn't have. So, their job is going to be to help students to do their peers, to have a experience where they get to think some of the thinks that they've had throughout the unit. So the student who read from the insider list now has different connections. They're Pandora bringing that keepsake angle, or the student who followed the Prometheus narrative brings AI ethics, or in this way, they're Netflix house bringing the immersive experience. And the student who watched Psychopaths brings genre analysis. They're NYX bringing the transformation lens. So they have different expertise, same intellectual work, same world. And I don't know if you see this immediately, but I'm thinking personally that if I've been drawn to Psychopaths and then I get to talk about it with my peers, that's going to be a more interesting experience to me than just the straight synthesis of Frankenstein. So you can see where a student will be like, okay, I can see where I have the payoff of what I've been doing all unit. So these are the 5 options that they get. Looking at the parallel narrative, what does it reveal about the creation and responsibility? And I can give them a little bit of specificity of what they might look for, but I can also leave it open depending on my students to say, like, you've been exploring, help them think some of these things. All 5 options are legitimate and all 5 will lead to strong conversations, but every option asks for the same cognitive work. They're going to facilitate a conversation using an insight that they've built. And the choice is really in which door you walk through, not which operation you perform. And notice what I'm not doing. I'm not asking students to suddenly produce a poem or a podcast or a poster. We've been building analytical and discussion skills all unit, so that's what I'm assessing. The differentiation is in what they analyze, not how they show their learning. So here's a key. I'm being a little sneaky here. I don't announce this at the beginning of the unit. The enrichment, the insiders list, the playlist is woven into the unit as we go. So students who engage discover those opportunities, and those that don't just do the regular work, which is fine. And when I reveal the choice board at the end, students who engage realize, oh, all that reading I did, all those rabbit holes I explored, that wasn't extra. That was preparation for this task. So they're not being rewarded with points. They're being rewarded with having something to say when it matters that's going to be interesting and engaging for them. And the students who didn't engage, they still have option 5 and they can lead a strong conversation from the core unit material. So it's not a consolation prize. The synthesis is real expertise, but they'll notice that their classmates who went deeper have more to bring. And I have this set up for honors where I have most of the options here are for looking at that engagement layer. But maybe depending on your class, you want to have more like synthesis options, and then you have like those fewer enrichment options that they would be pulling from. But what the hope is by giving like showing them that now if they did something different, they can use that in their work, then maybe next unit they choose more of that enrichment. And I'll say at this point, they will have already shown me that they've been engaging. So it's not like, oh, psychopath sounds interesting. I want to do that. No, that's not what's happening here. You have to have already demonstrated that you are exploring during the unit. Um, what's really important here is to make sure that whatever you do have that is core is a legitimate choice. So students who didn't do enrichment shouldn't feel punished. Option 5 is real intellectual work. And what we're doing is just framing it as a different kind of expertise and not the fallback. So for you, look at what you've inventoried throughout this training. So your rabbit holes from episode 1, your book list from episode 2, and your sequence passages from episode 3. If students engage with different pieces of this throughout a unit, what conversation could they lead at the end that no one else could? And this doesn't necessarily have to be what I had here, a conversation. It could be an essay. It could be some kind of creative response, depending on what you built them up to during the unit. So just thinking about what your doors are. Um, and when we look at Julian, He's been building this all unit. He's read from the insider's list. He went down the Cosmos rabbit hole. He brought Faraday into the day 8 discussion. His partner noticed. And when he looks at the choice board, he sees those 5 doors and he can pick the one where he has the most to say, which is going to be with Cosmos, ideally, right? Where he can take Faraday's story and talk about what it reveals about Victor because he's already thought about that. And that's something that has colored his reading as he has worked through this unit. When he does this, he is able to bring that knowledge to the rest of his group, help them make connections that he didn't see coming, and actually have that kind of dialogue with his peers that we hope that they would see. So I think one of the things that's important, regardless of what your output is, whether you choose a conversation or not, is to have students clearly bringing their information back to the rest of their class. So if they're writing essays, having peer conversations or sharing in some way. And I think this is what the whole system was building toward, not that isolated enrichment, but engagement that really elevates the room. And in order to do that, they need to like see what else was happening in the room. I want to name something that's happening in the system that I haven't made explicit yet. So, jigsaw learning, the classic cooperative structure. You divide content into pieces and then assign each piece to different students, and then they become experts. Then they teach each other. The research on jigsaws is really strong. Interdependence, accountability, and every student has something the group needs. You can't coast because your piece matters, but if you've tried to run a jigsaw in your classroom, you also know the reality. The planning is intense. You're dividing content really carefully and creating expert group materials, designing the teaching back protocol, managing movement, troubleshooting the group that didn't actually learn their piece well enough to teach it, all kinds of things. And if one student is absent, or if one expert group gets off track, the whole thing can wobble a bit. Jigsaws work for sure. They are my favorite strategy to use, but they're also exhausting to orchestrate. So here's what I want you to notice about what we've built here. At the choice board, Julian brings Faraday, and another student brings Psychopaths. Another brings a book from the insider's list, and another synthesized the core unit materials in a way no one else did. They're not presenting what they learned, they're facilitating conversations from their area of expertise. Each student has something the others don't have. That's a jigsaw, essentially. That's interdependence, but you didn't have to engineer it in the same way. You didn't have to divide up content and assign it and tell them exactly what to do. Students chose their own paths, and some went down rabbit holes. Some read books, some stuck with the core materials and went deep there. The expertise differentiates naturally based on curiosity and interest and choice. And now, in small group conversations, each student is the only one who knows what they know. Their group needs them, which is exactly what you want from jigsaws. So the kid who watched Cosmos is the only one who can bring Faraday. The kid who read the retelling is the only one who can bring that parallel. And the kid who followed the Prometheus enhancement is the only one who can bring the AI ethics angle. Jigsaw interdependence without the jigsaw planning. And there's something else that jigsaws do. They build classroom community. If you know about the background of jigsaws, you understand why this is so effective. It was really to try to bring different groups together in order to learn well in a way that they needed to depend on each other and build classroom community. So when you need what someone else knows, you have to listen. You have to value their contribution. You can't dismiss them because you literally don't have what they have. And if you know that you need to use it later, that you just have to listen. And that's what's happening here. So when Julian's partner asks, "Where did you get that?" That's not politeness, that's curiosity. And Julian has something she doesn't. And when we get to the choice board, students are leaning in because their classmate is the expert on this one thing. So it's not the teacher, it's their peer. And when that kind of intellectual engagement becomes distributed, when those students know different things, the room starts to need each other differently. That's community built on intellectual interdependence. It's not icebreakers or team building exercises. It's an actual need, so it's more organic. And one more thing that's happening that matters for reading development. Every time a student goes down a rabbit hole and they read a book from a list or they explore a connection, they're building background knowledge, schema. We know from reading research that comprehension isn't just a skill, it's knowledge. The more you know about a topic, the better you read text about that topic. So when Julian watches Cosmos, it's not just enrichment, he's also building that schema. He now knows about Faraday, about self education in the 19th century, and about who got welcomed into scientific communities and who didn't. And when he reads Frankenstein, that knowledge is active. He's making connections a student without that schema can't make. So the student who read a Frankenstein retelling now has two versions of the story in her head. She's reading comparatively whether she means to or not. Anyone who really did a deep dive into the Regency era now has historical context that makes Shelley's radicalism land differently. This is how readers develop. It's not just through skills instruction, it's not just by showing them how sentences work. It's important, but through knowledge accumulation, that's what makes text richer. So your insider list really is an extra. It's part of the instruction for students who are ready for it. It's schema building. It's making your students better readers of your anchor text by giving them more to bring to it. So here's what you've actually built: jigsaw interdependence without the planning overhead, classroom community built on intellectual need, schema development that makes your anchor text land harder. And you didn't create a single new assignment. You curated content you already knew about into a structure students could access. So you now have built an entire system. The students have space to explore, challenges to pursue, embedded stretch for everyone, and the payoff is where it comes together. So let's just trace Julian's arc one more time. When we are in episode 1, he saw the habits modeled in the insider list and started to understand more about what it would mean to be an advanced student. And up until then, he just thought it was finishing efficiently. But now he has a challenge with shape, something that he can win, and he picks a category. And then he gets to episode 2, where he's working through the playlist with a partner. He brings something from his independent reading, and his partner notices. In episode 3, he's able to facilitate a conversation where he brings an insight that no one else has, and that has an impact on the room. So he's not transforming into a different person. He's really just finding out what engagement looked like and then discovering that he wanted it. There are unifying principles here. We want to make sure that we are recognizing students that this is not just about grades. It's not extra credit, and the playlist isn't graded differently. The choice board doesn't give bonus points for harder options, but students who engage are recognized through having more to say and being the one who brings something new through that invisible points unlock those opportunities. So we want to remember the reward is intrinsic. So keeping engaged students engaged is easier than re-engaging those checked out ones. Let's take a very slight detour and talk for a second about the structure that we are working in. Let's talk specifically about PLCs. So, what are PLCs supposed to be? Professional learning communities. The idea is simple: teachers share what's working, you try something, it works, you bring it to the team, you have that collective wisdom, and everyone gets better. That's the vision. But here's what actually happens: PLC becomes about alignment, pacing guides, common assessments, making sure everyone is in the same place. And when you do talk about instruction, there's this pressure to find the answer, like the single best strategy, the one approach that will work for all students in all sections. So you often, depending on your PLC, might negotiate toward the middle to the thing everyone can do, the thing that fits every teaching style and every classroom context, if that is how your PLC works, that you all have to teach the same thing. So in this case, what happens is you end up with a minimum viable curriculum, not because anyone wanted that, because consensus pushes toward the common denominator. So the teacher who found something brilliant, she might share it, but then it has to work for everyone or it doesn't become the thing we do. So it gets sanded down or it just doesn't get adopted. Her best lesson stays in her room, and the PLC moves on to pacing. And it could be that her best lesson does not work for your unit because of various reasons. So, what if we thought about this differently and shared lessons had a different kind of home? So, this is where the enrichment layer changes. So your colleague has a lesson she loves. Maybe it's a creative way into Paradise Lost or historical context that makes the DeLacy family land differently. Or maybe it's an activity that gets students thinking about Victor's responsibility. In a traditional PLC, that lesson either becomes required for everyone or it stays in her room. The enrichment layer gives it a third option. It goes on the shared insider list. Not as everyone must teach this, but as students who want to go deeper can access this. Now her best lesson is available to students in your section, not because you assigned it, because it's there in the enrichment layer and curious students can find it. So I think this could change the way we have PLC conversations and really change what PLC is even for. So instead of what's the one strategy we should all use, it becomes what's working for you that we could add to the shared layer. So you're not trying to find the single best approach. You're collecting multiple approaches and multiple entry points and multiple ways in. So maybe one teacher strength is historical context, another is creative activities, another's is close reading sequences, another is maybe text to film connection. So all of it can go into this layer and students access what calls to them. So then the curriculum becomes really robust, full of options and full of expertise instead of the minimum. If we think about the history of PLCs, it is not designed for today. This is a way for us to think about do we have at our fingertips as far as technology that we can really bring other classrooms into our own and in a way that we don't have to replace necessarily what we already know is working well in our classroom. It gives students the opportunity to go deeper and to explore and to really kind of peek inside other classrooms as well. Here's something specific you can do. Let's say your colleague teaches the Satan soliloquy sequence better than you do because she's been doing it for years. She has the moves down. You can try to learn her lesson and adopt it and make it yours. Or maybe she records herself teaching it 10 minutes, walks through the annotation, explains lens, models the thinking. This could even be during class. And that video goes on the shared insiders list. Now, your students, the ones who want to go deeper, can learn directly from her. They're getting her best teaching, not your approximation of it. And you can learn from her too and seeing the exact way that she did it. I have this pet peeve that we talk about teaching as if it is a pile of PDFs. It's just a set of lessons. And really, it's the delivery. And in this way, if we think about this shared layer and how we might share lessons in a different way, we do get to learn differently from our colleagues. So in this case, it's not replacement. You're still teaching the core, but that enrichment layer lets students access the collective expertise of the whole team. And that may be core for her, but really, when we're talking about skills, it doesn't necessarily need to be core for you. So the kid in your room who's ready for more, he can learn from every teacher in the department, not just you. And when your PLC shares this way, you're building something together. It's not a pacing guide, it's not a common assessment, it's a resource that grows. And every unit, teachers add what works. Their very best, like their favoriteest, those rabbit holes they found, the connections they made, the activities that landed. And by spring, the shared insiders list has contributions from everyone, and it's richer than any single teacher could build alone. And students, any student in any section can access all of it. That's what PLCs were supposed to be. Collective wisdom actually shared, not negotiated down to what everyone can agree on. Instead, we can make something that's curated up that none of you could build on. And again, insiders lift the whole room. And this is where Rising Tide actually works. Julian's engagement doesn't just benefit Julian. When he brings Faraday into the day 8 discussion, his partner hears it and maybe he brings it to whole class discussion. And when he facilitates a strong conversation, his group really starts to think differently. So the system is designed so that individual depth becomes collective elevation. Um, we want to make sure that you're curating from expertise and not creating from scratch. You don't need to create the insider list titles. You can select them from books you already know and love. You don't even have to give them any titles at all. You could just give them the categories. You don't have to design the Prometheus narrative from nothing because you found that content and you were able to connect it. So you're curating, not creating. You're looking back through your drive, you're talking to other teachers and what they're doing and bringing those in as options for students. Netflix built an entire ecosystem around one show. They had that Tadam website for exploration, the premiere Masquerade for a curated experience, and then they had the brand partnerships for the different entry points for fans. So, three strategies, same goal to create insiders who really love the show more because they went deeper. And this is the same thing that we want to create for our units. And you can do that with what you already know.